Welcome to the 25th Annual Milken Institute Global Conference. We are delighted to have you join us here in Los Angeles and around the world.
No matter where we're born, no matter the circumstances, each and every one of us deserve the opportunity for a meaningful life. Our lives are made richer by our ability to impact one another.
Opportunities for every person should be based on their ability, not based on race, gender, religion, where they went to school, or who their parents are. It is impossible to succeed ourselves without helping others.
From the halls of Congress to global conferences, innovative thinking, translated into action, helps level the playing field for all of us.
Historically, clinical trials have not included diverse patients, and on average, it takes 12 years and $1.4 billion to take a new therapy from the laboratory to patients' hands.
Milken Institute brings together leaders from various sectors to generate new ideas that leads to fair and equitable future.
Because if there's one thing we want to pass on to our children, it's that their futures are possible, as long as there is commitment to make it so.
We recognize that global problems often have local solutions, and local problems left unaddressed often have global consequences. So we weave together a cogent response from the philanthropic, science, business, and government sectors.
After all, leaving the world better than we found it is a priceless gift. Except it doesn't just happen. You have to make it happen. That's where the Milken Institute comes in, connecting resources and innovation so the best ideas can succeed.
Please welcome CEO of the Milken Institute, Michael Clouden.
Good morning, and a very warm welcome to everyone in attendance. Whether you're here or streaming live on this, the opening day of public sessions for the 25th Annual Milken Institute Global Conference. We've come a very long way from our first conference, which was just one day, 60 speakers in downtown Los Angeles. 20 years ago, We feel we've now become one of, if not the leading convening body in the United States for bringing together everyone to exchange ideas, build partnerships, and truly celebrate the power of connection, which you may have noticed is the theme of this year's event. Global Conference is important on a number of levels. It provides the substantial revenue that supports the Institute's year-round programmatic work. But it also, in and of itself, enables people to engage in conversation, exchange ideas, and be stimulated to achieve new goals. Our flagship event's 25th year is an appropriate time to reflect on our commitment to fostering open and honest dialogue between people with differing points of view. The magic of Global Conference and our other year-round convenings is that we gather unlikely bedfellows, not just to see the world through different eyes, as we often say, but also to hear with different ears. This is far more important today than ever, as listening seems to be a skill we've lost. Too often bring their own facts to discussions, which makes the importance of listening to those with whom we disagree all the more challenging. So as a result, we tend to talk at each other rather than with each other. We don't need to agree, but we need to understand where we each are coming from across sectors, across borders, and certainly across the aisle. Throughout the public program and our private events, we're bringing together those varying perspectives and agendas in search of common ground that opens the door to finding solutions to our most urgent challenges. In all honesty, that's a tall order, but it's one we continue to pursue undaunted as a key part of our mission. And I'm asking you to be a part of that mission this week. I look forward to the next 3 days of conversation, and I encourage you to learn something new, choose your own adventure, and perhaps step into a session or two you otherwise wouldn't. Now, it's really inspiring to be here once again, experiencing the transformative energy of our supporters, and to participate in such pressing dialogue as we tackle some of the most challenging issues facing us today. The Milken Institute has developed an impactful program to enable our influential audiences to discuss topics that remain so pivotal now and in the years ahead. So over the next 3 days, you'll hear from more than 800 speakers across more than 120 public sessions on 13 different tracks, including topics ranging from trade and economics to healthcare and the environment and far more. So thank you for choosing to spend your time with us for what we know is going to be a truly productive and stimulating experience. And now that I've asked you all to listen to each other, I want you to know that we are listening to you also. In our third year of partnering with the Harris Poll, we've asked our Global Conference participants how you are accelerating social progress and addressing some of today's greatest challenges. So please join me in welcoming to the stage a good friend of the Milken Institute and CEO of the Harris Poll, John Gersma, who will be presenting some fascinating insight from this year's 2022 Milken Institute Harris Poll Listening Project. John?
Good morning. Each year, the Milken Institute and the Harris Poll survey 17,000 respondents across 27 countries, trying to understand the needs of people around the world. As Michael mentioned, this year, the focus of the Listening Project is actually on you. And I thank you as a researcher if you took part in our survey. What I'm going to do in the brief 5 minutes is give you a quick top line of some of the interesting things that we think we found. First of all, we compared your views to the American public that we conduct weekly in Harris Poll surveys, And not surprisingly, with double-digit inflation, the likes of which we haven't seen in 40 years, this is a significant issue of both the Milken Institute membership here, as well as the US general public, followed by the Russian war in Ukraine, supply chain constraints, labor shortages, which is clearly more important to business than the public, and COVID-19. But what's interesting is that the impact varies in terms of their sort of duration. We also asked you how much of the following issues impact your current business operations. We asked if it's impacting you significantly now. Is it limited to specific regions? Is it an isolated change, or is it not currently impacting your business? And what you can see is that inflation clearly is the present focus of a drag on everything focused right now in our business, followed by labor shortages at 43% and 31% respectively. However, you can see that labor shortages are limited more to specific regions, whereas supply chain constraints are actually spread out a quarter across significant impact to limited to isolated to some not even currently impacting our business. Again, the Russian war in Ukraine and the COVID-19 pandemic, while highly correlated, are not as having as a significant as an immediate impact. But what I think what starts to get sort of interesting in the data is we ask this question hypothetically: if the following challenge was resolved today, how long do you estimate it would take you to get back to business as usual? And inflation, labor shortages, supply chains, the majority of you, at more than 50%, said that these could be solved within 3 months, with another quarter of you saying that it would take probably roughly 3 to 6 months to come back to recovery. And I think what's sort of interesting about this also is that underneath this is this undercurrent of optimism. In fact, when we asked how strong or weak do you think the US economy is today, 2/3 of you, 68%, said that it's stronger, in fact, than other economies, including the inverse of the global economy, where only 33% of you said it was strong. So that started to get us interested as researchers try to understand this resiliency and this sort of hidden optimism. So we went a little bit deeper into the numbers and looked again at inflation with respect to the general public. Again, historic inflation, when we looked at the Milken Institute GCL, you are actually twice as likely to believe that inflation will taper off, and 1/4 is likely to think it will get even higher than the public. So I'm not sugarcoating an obvious current challenge in today's world, but what is interesting to us is that there seems to be a shift within the mindset of the business community here at the Milken Institute Global Conference. Because we also asked, are we living with COVID, or are we going to fix it? Are we going to solve it? And 96% of you said that it is going to last in some form. So to some extent, we have priced in COVID, as have the general public now in the United States at 70%. And look how far we've come from October, when we were here together in 27 countries, 17,000 people, 56% said the worst was still ahead. So when we start to look at this, what was very interesting to us is that clearly there's significant clouds of volatility, geopolitical uncertainty that is hampering business and our economy at large. But when you start to look at what you are focused on as the membership, 76% of you, 3/4, said changing generational values, we believe, are going to have a little or a lot of an impact on our business. Folks, this is at the same level as regulatory uncertainty, geopolitical instability, labor and supply chain. Also followed behind that was hybrid work and working from home at 63%, then followed by meta, cryptocurrencies, and NFTs. The point here, as a quick summary, is that we have a tremendous amount of volatility and uncertainty, yet the membership here is looking past that to some of these underlying structural challenges in society that are going to reshape tomorrow's economy. So as you think about that, we go forward, remember that there is significant trust in the business community. In our data, as we've seen around the world and in America, 3/4 believe that large companies are more vital today to America's future, 60% believe they're more reliable than the government, and 54% trust them more than the government to getting involved in these challenges. So I'd encourage you to take a look at our report in greater detail, and I hope you enjoy the rest of the conference. Thank you.
Thank you, John. That was a great start, very thought-provoking, to lay some groundwork for the next 3 days of discussions. Now, we've put together a great program for you to discuss so many of these topics. We also do far more than just our convenings, as wonderful as they are. We do work throughout the year, which is highlighted in the video that you saw, that's highlighted in a brochure that's in the bags that you can pick up if you haven't gotten them yet, that outlines some of this year's initiatives. The fabulous work of our centers at the Milken Institute, our departments, and all of us is really made possible because of the generous support of our sponsors and strategic partners. And they provide not only financial support, but they provide intellectual contributions toward our programmatic efforts. And their support of the Institute in these last 2 years has been wonderful. Many of those supporters are listed on a donor wall as you go back toward the Executive Center. But I'd like to take a moment here to thank the sponsors of this conference and our strategic partners who have made this happen. So please join me now in listening to them. Just takes a minute or so, and then thanking them for their contributions. And have a wonderful conference.
The Milken Institute wishes to thank our sponsors and strategic partners for their support. Without their generosity, our work and the global conference would not be possible. Our platinum sponsors: our gold sponsors: our silver sponsors: our bronze sponsors: We thank our strategic partners for their significant annual support of the Milken Institute. Thank you all.
Please welcome the panel on Global Capital Markets, moderated by anchor of Bloomberg Quick Take, Scarlet Fu.
Thank you, everyone. Good morning to you, and thank you for joining us for this opening panel. It's such a great conversation and a great topic, and we have a fantastic lineup of folks to talk us through it. starting with Scott Meinert of Guggenheim, Rishi Kapoor of Investcorp, David Hunt of PGIM, Jane Fraser of Citi, and André Esteves of BTG Pactual. We have a lot to discuss, so I want to jump straight into everything. Clearly, when you talk about the outlook for global capital markets, so much of it depends on the Fed, whether it is behind the curve, too little, too late with its planned series of interest rate increases to restrain inflation that was triggered by the pandemic and then compounded by the war in Ukraine. Higher rates, we know, will slow down the economy. So my first question is recession inevitable? Jane, let me start with you.
It's not inevitable, but it's a concern. It depends a little bit where in the world that you're looking at as to who's feeling more or less comfortable. So I'm more of an optimist on the US. We've got strong labor markets here. We've got a very healthy consumer, good corporate balance sheets, but we've had one heck of a supply shock hit the world. It's obviously hit Europe more strongly. I think there's more concern about stagflation there. And it's going to keep on rolling with COVID in China. It keeps piling onto these supply chains and the challenges that are being faced. Far too much liquidity out there as well. So it's definitely a risk. I'm much more optimistic on the States. I'm very concerned about Europe.
Yeah, everyone keeps saying, or there's this idea that Europe may already be in recession, in large part because of the dependence on Russia for its energy needs. So I want to go to you, Andres, about energy, because Latin America is home to so much of the world's commodities. What are you seeing and hearing from the companies that extract and produce these commodities? How are they positioning right now and for the next 5 years?
I think, first going back to the first question, I think recession is not inevitable, but it's almost there. I think Fed is structurally behind the curve, historically behind the curve, in one of the most challenging moments of record monetary expansion, record fiscal expansion, and a number of middle-term inflationary pressures, right? Like green transition, disruptions of supply chains from COVID, disruption of supply chains from the war, a number of things that will be with us, unfortunately, for a certain period of time. And commodities is part of this universe. And commodities price pressure, no matter if it's in metals and mining, agris, or energy-related commodities, I think we'll be there also for a certain period of time. It's different from the super cycle of 15, 20 years ago. Different reasons, but the effects are similar the same. And this time on a more synchronized way, because if you look, all the commodity space is moving in the same direction, even uncorrelated commodities. And companies are responding to that. They're increasing the investments, but unfortunately not in the same pace that demand is demanding.
Okay. Scott, I'm looking over at you, and I know you have a lot of thoughts on this. Are we going to get a garden variety recession or something deeper?
Well, I think the recession itself is likely to not be that bad, only because the Fed, I think, will probably pivot quickly. But, you know, it's interesting, Scarlett, we have never been able to reduce inflation by more than 2 percentage points in the US historically without inducing recession. So if today we're, let's say, around 8.5% for CPI, give or take, and the Fed would like something closer to 2, we've got a lot of ground to cover. And so I think that it's going to be really hard for the Fed to maneuver into a soft landing. But the other side of this is I'm afraid we're moving so quickly and we're starting to see prices roll over, meaning the second derivative, you know, where the acceleration is slowing down, that we could set ourselves up for a financial accident. But I think a recession is probably something we talk about at the end of next year, not this year.
Rishi, what about from your point of view, especially when it comes to Asia and the rest of the world?
Yeah, no, I think exactly along those lines. You know, we are sitting here in LA. Actually, let me take a step back first and just say it's great to see everyone here in this conference. You know, and much like Mr. Twain said, the demise of the conference is much exaggerated, I think. But taking a step back, it's easy to get influenced by what is happening in the United States. But the reality is that not all markets and not all asset classes are equal. Yes, in the US, the odds are stacked against the likelihood of a soft landing, just given the pace of interest rate rises that the Fed is going to have to embark on to contain and tame inflation. Some of those effects are, kind of counter to each other almost, and they should self-mitigate some of the pressures that we are seeing on prices. But if you step outside the United States and you look at markets, for example, like the Middle East is booming right now. Saudi Arabia, for instance, just last week announced its first quarter GDP results, close to 10%. And that is before the second order trickle-down effect of higher oil prices.
So only go up?
Yeah, it'll go up, and same with several markets in Asia. We are present in India. We are seeing very strong growth trends over there. And one of the reasons over there is because the pendulum in terms of easy monetary policy hadn't really quite swung that far. So it's going to be a little bit more nuanced than painting everything with the same brush. And in the middle of all that, it means basically for people like us operating within the capital markets, the beta from capital markets is going to be very muted. We really have to start figuring out differentiated assets and markets that we want to lean into with time.
David, what about you? I mean, Rishi mentioned nuance, and when you look at what the market is anticipating, successive 50 basis point rate increases for the next couple of months, maybe 5 times by the end of the year. It sounds awfully dramatic considering where we were at the start of 2020. Is there such a thing anymore as an average rate hike cycle that we might anticipate from the Federal Reserve?
Yeah, probably not. And let me try to pull together some of the strands from the discussion we've had. So since the GFC, we have all operated largely in an environment of low growth, low inflation, and quite honestly, low rates. And that was true right across the developed economy. And we had good growth from much of the emerging markets. And that lasted right up until the pandemic. And then coming out of the pandemic, largely due to very different ways of treating the pandemic, but also because of very different policy responses, we now find ourselves where fundamentally countries are coming out of this at very different trajectories. So China, we actually see a pretty rapid slowing of growth, and the central bank is quite dovish. We see in Japan low inflation, low growth, and a central bank that seems to keep trying to get their inflation going. In Europe, personally, I think we're only one hydrocarbon sanction away from a recession starting. And in the US, you've got to believe that the Fed is likely to keep tightening, exactly as you said, to the point where we probably slide into a recession. And I agree with Scott, probably more in the 2024 timeframe. But for all of us that manage money, we've been living in this world where it was more important to choose sectors maybe than other things. And now, country and currency are incredibly important because we are in very different places around the world, and that lens of how you handle individual country risk and individual currency risk is much more important than it was in the previous 10 years.
Yeah, I think that's critical. Although there is this temptation to keep looking back into the past for lessons that we can learn. And one common framework that people rely on is this comparison to the 1970s when we last had this bout of inflation that was triggered by energy. Scott, I know that you look at this carefully and you think that the 1970s is the wrong point of comparison. What can policymakers learn from another era, which is post-World War II?
Right, yeah, the 1940s look a lot more like what we're living through today. It's really interesting. 2 years ago, I heard everybody telling me the pandemic was like a war, and we needed to go to wartime footing, and we did. And we did very much the same thing we did during the Second World War. We spent a lot of money at the federal level, and we monetized the debt at the central bank. So, now the Federal Reserve has basically said we're done with that. In the 40s, when the war ended, inflation spiked to 20% in 1946, and then slowly tailed off until 1949 when we had a mild recession and a deflation. If the Fed would just stop printing money, which is what it did in 1946, then slowly, the new price level we're adjusting to, which we're not going back down, right? This is a permanent increase, a new plateau. But there's no reason to think that we're about to go into a spiral. One last thing I'd say about the 1970s is we were fighting. We had the Great Society. We were fighting a war in Vietnam. We delinked from gold in Bretton Woods. The dollar collapsed. If you look at the dollar today, it's strong. There are wars everywhere in the world, but at the same time, the U.S. still has a sort of haven aspect to it.
I really think that historical parallels, though, are hard. because what's kept inflation low for the last 20 years are very different than what we saw at any point in history. You know, the role of technology was fundamentally deflationary. Demographics in the developed world was fundamentally deflationary. And I think really importantly, and maybe less talked about, is the role actually that globalization played in keeping inflation down. So I could argue that the leading export of China over the last 20 years was deflation. And I think that that is really the question that we need to focus on now. Will we go back to a world where global economy goes into reverse, which I think will be a very inflationary move? Or do we go into a world where actually globalization continues, but it becomes supply chains get much more diversified and it's less focused on China, but globalization continues, which gradually I think will be deflationary. But that is the question to look at. If we have a real stop to globalization, inflation will be fundamentally higher.
So Jade, let me put that to you. Where do you think we are in this globalization effort? Because different companies are thinking through how they're planning their moves in different countries. Citigroup, for instance, is retreating in several markets, at least its consumer banking operations. So you're thinking about this constantly.
Yeah, people talk about is globalization dead? Has it gone into reverse? I think they're missing. That's a simplistic view, but globalization's clearly changing. And we're seeing, I think, an acceleration of some of the trends that had started pre-COVID and that the war has accelerated even further. We're starting to see questions of, will there be an alternate financial system developed? We're seeing from supply chains a desire to move away from China, but the reality is, when we look at the US, we're importing more goods from China today than we were before, and it's very hard to make these huge structural changes to supply chain. China is very efficient, it's got scale, and it's really, really good at a number of things. So I think we certainly will start seeing more splintering. I tend to think of one of the things going on at the moment is there's a new S in ESG, which is security. So maybe it's ESGs these days. And that security can be food security, it's energy security, it's operational resilience, it's cyber, it's defense. But what it's meaning is you're starting to see more splintering, you're starting to see more redundancies being built up. That's going to be a 5 to 10 year transition in many instances. It's big, but it doesn't happen overnight.
Andres, jump in here. What are your thoughts here on globalization and this backtracking from this idea that we've become more globalized and inflation?
I think, as was said before, we are doing some sort of retreat on globalization, which is part of the normal course, but certainly we had the privilege of we are a generation of business people that got the benefit of this amazing labor arbitrage, tax arbitrage, and this search for efficiency for the global companies, and that I call the peace dividend since 1989 with the Berlin Wall fall. And unfortunately, part of that, for the reasons that Jane just described, the food security, energy security, cyber security, healthcare security, I think will retreat. And there is no doubt that some way and somehow this is an inflationary pressure for us, for different reasons, because we'll be less optimized, less productive, commodities price will be under pressure. The combination of these factors, and I would add, again, on the top of that, this green transition that is not related to supply chain, but it's related to a good choice of our societies in decarbonize our planet, and it's a necessity, has also on the short and middle term some implications in terms of inflationary pressure. So I think, of course, we are in a peak of inflation. I don't think we are in a spiral of inflation, and the key issue will not be moving from 8.5 of CPI inflation to 5 or 4.5 or 4 or 5.5, but we'll be moving from these new levels to 2%, which is our inflation target. Then will be the real test, the real discussion, and probably will be for next year discussion, not this year. But yes, unfortunately, I do see a more inflationary world ahead of us.
I'm glad you bring up the term inflationary spiral, because that's something that comes up quite a bit. How self-reinforcing are the price increases that we're seeing right now? To what extent are we already in a wage spiral where Higher prices lead to higher wages, which pushes prices up ever more. What needs to happen for that cycle to break? Rishi, let me ask you that question.
Yeah, I mean, that's what I was touching upon earlier as well. Some of the effects that we are seeing driving the current inflationary impulse, there are natural offsets to those, right? So let's start with the supply chain blockages emanating out of the lockdowns in China in particular. They're going to resolve themselves over a period of time. It's not going to take 5 years. And if you take a step back and you look at where the market expectations are for inflation 3 years and 5 years out, they're not that much higher than the long-term 10-year trend. They're about 70, 75 basis points higher. So the market is also anticipating that the reshoring and nearshoring of supply chains that is likely to happen, which may have to some extent an inflationary impact in the near term, in the long term is actually going to be somewhat disinflationary. This is counterintuitive. In fact, globalization became inflationary because of our reliance on foreign supply chains that were, kind of a constraint. Secondly, labor and wage inflation. If you want to look at one of the silver linings of the conflict in Ukraine and Europe, there's going to be a pretty significant refugee, inflow into Europe as well as into the United States, and these are highly skilled people coming out of Central Europe. That's going to ease some of the inflationary pressure that we are seeing on wages. The US is likely to modify its immigration policy, or attenuate it at least. That's going to lead to some moderation. But more. So
you see a relief in the tight labor market in the US because of the war in Ukraine?
More than likely, yeah. It's hard to pin down second-order effects like that with precision in advance. But if you look into what has happened historically in the past, this is a likely outcome from a wage perspective.
Is anyone talking about stagflation or transitory inflation anymore, David?
Yeah, I think we've said goodbye to transitory at this point.
Even the modifications to it, like sustained transitory, that lived on for a little bit.
No, I think it's very interesting that people actually have largely voted, at least in the markets, that inflation is going to be higher going forward. I think what's interesting though is how different asset classes are viewing inflation and also the economic outlook. So if you look right now in the fixed income markets and you look at the forward curves, you would say, wow, we've had an inversion. Yeah. We've had, yes, it looks like the neutral rate is now heading up toward 3. And boy, the fixed income markets would say there's a heightened chance of a recession going forward. In the equities markets, at least until April, you would say, no, the soft landing is here to stay. They really had a much rosier view. And I think over April that began to erode a little bit. And yet, if you look at real estate, we're the third largest real estate investor in the world. It's booming. I mean, transactions are up, prices are up. Actually, almost all the food groups are up, maybe with the exception of retail. And they are looking right through this recession as a view that inflation is actually really good for the asset class. So I think you also have to be careful about the implications for investors from some of these things, because on some asset classes, it's actually really good that we're going to have a little bit of a slowdown.
If I jump in a bit on some of it, it's interesting at the moment. There's so much uncertainty. The one thing we do know is volatility is extraordinary. We have the same volatility right now as we had in 2008 and 2009 in the markets. You're also seeing really strange things. Look at Friday. You had the bond market sell off at the same time as equities. Sadly, I remember the 70s and 80s, and I don't remember days like that. And some of this is just very odd dynamics around supply-demand. I think, Scott, you've talked a lot about this as well in terms of the huge amount of inflation that's out there. Credit-based conference here. I think the credit markets are opening up, which is the one little rosy sign here at the moment, that's picking up. But it's telling you there is an extreme range of outcomes that are in there in the market at the moment, and there's a full range. So when volatility is 2008, 2009 levels, that's telling you that no one knows what this is going to be.
There's no conviction, and there's a wide range, no consensus.
Yet.
I want to bring in a visual that Scott's team prepared. Anyone see Office Space? Do you guys remember Office Space from the 90s? Yeah? Okay. Bill Lumbergh, anyone? Yeah, good? Okay, let's pull up the visual of Bill Lumbergh talking about the Fed and the neutral rate, the natural rate. If we could pull that up. He basically tells his team if the Federal Reserve would let the federal funds rate rise to its natural level, and we'll pull it up, but you guys can all picture Bill Lumbergh with his red suspenders saying, that would be great, yeah, okay? Maybe that's the guy from South Park. There we go, Bill Lumbergh. If the Fed would let the federal funds rate rise to its natural level, that would be great. Scott Minerd, you join Bloomberg every Fed day to talk through what the central bank will do and how to interpret its various forecasts, its messaging to investors, to banks, to the rest of the world. What is the Fed going to do? What is the Fed's biggest mission on Wednesday when it comes to setting the tone for the rest of the year?
Well, I mean, look, they're going to be very focused on, resetting the short-term rate, which they'll do by 0.5%, I think. And they'll try to tell us where they're going to take rates in the future and the path. The thing here that I am concerned about with the Fed is we don't know where the neutral rate or the natural rate of interest is.
Did we ever?
No. I mean, there are models like the one that was done by John Taylor with the Taylor rule. But even that model, when you look at it, it's so dynamic that it's a fast-moving rate of change. And so the neutral rate, which John predicted in his model, skyrocketed in a very short period of time. And it's just as likely to roll over and come back down just as fast. So, I'm a great skeptic that the Fed can figure out where this rate is. I don't think any of us are smart enough to do that. So, my view on this is, why don't we just unpeg rates, let the market find a neutral rate, and, it's what Paul Volcker did. And
open Pandora's box.
They did it in the 40s, right? So let's stop this idea of the idea that there's some wise council of men who sit in central banks that come up with perfect projections. In my career, I can say this. And I told Bill Dudley, who was the president of the New York Fed, this once. I go, the central bank is the source of and solution to every financial crisis we ever have. So
self-created.
They got us here, and they're going to get us out, and
Rishi, what about the other central banks of the world? Because the ECB, the BOE, they're also looking to loosen a bit.
And the BOJ.
And the BOJ.
I mean, their yield curve control is kind of blowing up on them right now.
Yeah.
So, it's the whole world, the liquidity tide is going out. And just like the tide came in so fast and we got this huge surge in economic activity and prices and employment, when the tide goes out, can we really gauge this that well? I would say this is a time for central banks to move deliberately, slowly, with caution. I feel that, 6 months ago, the Fed was telling us rates are at 0 to 2024. And now they're telling us, we're going to be at 3% by the end of the year, right? I mean, you can't, that kind of instability in terms of central bank policy, to Jane's point, just introduces all kinds of volatility into the markets.
Yeah.
I think the trick over here is really starting with the Fed, because they lead the rest of the world to a large extent, is for them to re-anchor inflationary expectations rather than the actual level of rates that they hit, either by the end of this year or by the middle of 2023. If they can re-anchor future expectations around that 2.5, 2.7 kind of percent, that has been the long-term average over the last several years, that leads to expectations in turn of price stability, they would have met their objective. And yes, it is absolutely true that over the last couple of years, the major central banks have added $8 trillion to the size of their balance sheet. Interest rates is not the only tool that they have in their kit. Quantitative tightening, as they initially at least stop redeploying the maturing proceeds and then maybe even start selling some of their non-treasury securities, starting with the US, that also is going to have a meaningful impact on withdrawal of the liquidity that is currently slushing around in the system like a bit of a drunken sailor, right? That withdrawal of liquidity and just clear, succinct messaging by the Fed to the markets, to the ultimate consumer, that price stability is not lost forever. It's going to come back. That will re-anchor expectations, and I'm actually a believer that notwithstanding the likelihood of a shallow, brief recession, either later this year or probably in the middle of next year, we should be able to come out over a 5-year cycle that we focus on as private market investors. That through the cycle view for us is still pretty constructive on the US economy and global growth generally speaking.
I have another visual that Jane's team contributed, and it really highlights what's going on with the US economy. If you don't follow the Federal Reserve, this really shows you the dynamic that's taking place. So the US economy is a boulder that's rolling downhill. Consumer spending, which I love is a woman, pushing it up, of course. You've got inflation, war, and rate hikes, pushing the boulder in the other direction. What do you think, Andres, is pushing up? If the boulder was Europe or Latin America or Asia, what's pushing against the boulder? What serves as consumer spending in those markets?
Well, just again, going back to the previous point, we talked a lot about the action of the Fed and the structure factors that would push the Fed. And all of them are middle-term and long-term implications, like the supply chains and the search for different sorts of securities in our societies. But before the long term, there is a short term.
Yeah.
And we are clearly in a classic economic cycle where unemployment is slightly above 3%, and probably in the second half of this year will be below 3% in US. So there is a classic monetary policy response for a classic economic cycle. So beyond all the structure factors that we are discussing, right? So, and this response that I agree that it's quite difficult to estimate what is the neutral nominal rate. It's very difficult, but I think the Fed will try to discover that in a more accelerated way, hiking rates probably 50 bips every meeting until we reach something around what the market estimates as the neutral rates. Having said that, and making a link to emerging markets or other economies like you suggested, I think China is the key player on our global scenario, and we didn't mention here that I think probably we have the most important challenging moment for Chinese economy, because not only economically, but it's also politically, right? You have the zero COVID policy, which is being extremely
that's pushing down on the boulder, if that boulder is China's economy. Yeah.
And you have a real estate dependency on of the Chinese economy that is much higher than all the other G20 economies. You have an overreach of credit inside the economy. So you have a number of factors that if it was not a centralized economy, all of us financiers here would probably estimating that a short-term crisis would come. Given that China works a little bit different and has been working a little bit different, but I don't know if it's as different as what we should expect of not having some sort of volatility come up from China, and together with that, some sort of global risk aversion that eventually would change the balance of this nice picture that we are seeing here. So I would include China as a risk factor and probably the most relevant outside US at this stage.
I'm glad you bring up China because, David, this is something you had mentioned. When we talk about China, when we talk about Russia, when we talk about Asia, we think of emerging markets, and it's this big category, and it's a little too big, really, that it's almost not useful anymore. You know, you've got developed economies, you've got Europe, you've got US, and you've got emerging markets. How useful of a categorization is that for you? Do you look at emerging markets that's its own asset class anymore?
So I'm really hoping that one of the things that will come out of the changes we're going through is the demise of emerging markets as a category. I don't know that Andre and I have talked about this, but I'd love your views as well. But you know, when you think about an index that has South Korea, China, Argentina, and by the way, until recently, Russia and the Ukraine in it, and you think, well, I'd like to kind of allocate to a basket like that, it sounds a little crazy. And so I would say a lot of the work we're doing with clients right now is one, creating custom approaches to investing in China, given all the things that we've talked about. And then secondly, breaking up emerging markets into a set of emerging markets that we think have really emerged, a set of them that we think are very commodity related. We think that's a different risk. And then some that we do see as frontier but very attractive economies. And I think that the world will quite soon pull apart emerging market indices, and we'll go to something that's a lot more tailored to the way that capital should be allocated. Scarlet.
Yeah, well, I totally agree. I think emerging markets these days, you could look at the countries and classify emerging markets as stock market. Well, stock markets, you have value stock, you have growth stock, you have small caps, you have big caps, you have different regions. So the same thing with emerging markets, right? You have commodity-based economy, you have frontier markets, you have risky geopolitical regions, you have safe geopolitical regions. So I wouldn't put emerging markets in an asset class. We can consider them different sorts of markets, but it's a big category of investments. And you mentioned Latin America before when I told about China, and I would look Latin America as the opposite of China. I think it's in a positive moment, not because of our talents, but because of our luck. We have the right things there, and it's a geopolitical safe region. And every time looking 500 back in history, 500 years back in history, every big political, geopolitical dislocation have winners and losers. And since Latin America is geographically close, safe, and cultural and sociological close to US or even to Europe or continental Europe, I think it's in a good moment. And the commodities producers, right, net exporters of energy commodities, of metals and minings, of agri-commodities. So as a category, I would consider Latin America in this place, which is, of course, very different from Eastern Europe, that we didn't reprice Russia risk or Ukraine risk. We repriced Eastern Europe risk. We repriced Taiwan risk. We repriced China risk. In Latin America, we price on the other way, right? Probably safer having part of your supply chain in Mexico or Brazil or your investments than in some of these regions that were very efficient, more efficient than Latin America in terms of production, but doesn't fit the demand for different sorts of security that we are now looking for.
So I think that's a really interesting point, that one unintended consequence of the war in Ukraine is that you have to reprice all of Eastern Europe. But if that's the case, and you think about China and its ambitions on Taiwan, do you then reprice Taiwan as well, and then you reprice the rest of Asia?
Yeah, independent of what was said or what will be explained and justified about these regions, we all repriced already these risks. There is a new price for this risk. Yeah. Everybody, no matter who says what, but we all repriced these risks already.
I think one of the things you've got to also recognize is what's been the response to the war in Ukraine has been the weaponization of financial services through the sanctions and the effect that that has on the psyche of where a lot of the wealth has been created. And Rishi and I have both been in the Middle East recently, and you'll hear the clients there, they'll be talking about the fact that they don't trust the Western financial order to put all the eggs in that basket going forward, that they're going to be looking at other places because the concern is, having made sanctions and the dislocation of the Russian economy from the global supply chains and the dislocation of the Russian financial market from the global financial market means a lot of other countries and other sources of wealth are quite concerned about what that means for, can they really trust the Western financial order the same way? So as we think about this in the future, where there's likely to be further geopolitics and issues in different parts of the world, I think you've got to anticipate the splintering of the old global financial order, the acceleration of new venues, be that the SWIFT alternatives and others that are going to be developing. And it's not that it's a two-world. There'll be many players that will operate in all parts of the world. There'll be others that have to make choices. But recognize that this weaponization of financial services is a very, very big deal. Every client I talk to around the world is talking about it, whether it's supply chain, finances, and the like. And it will probably accelerate the recognition of the importance of the emerging markets and the development of their own domestic capital markets. But this is such a game changer.
Scott, jump in.
Yeah, I think that to Jane's point, I tend to start to think of this as being a tripolar world. That, you know, we used to think of this as sort of East and West, but the reality is that China has shown us that they're going their own way. They're not jumping to the side of the Russians. They're not jumping to the side of the Western nations. They are, you know, working to try to get a deal with Saudi Arabia to be able to pay for oil in RMB. They just purchased coal from Russia with RMB. They want to make, you know, the yuan a global reserve currency. We see Israel has added RMB to its reserve holdings. So, you know, I think the world has got to get used to this idea that we are in the midst of a shift. And, you know, we've been talking about this for years, that, you know, the shift of power between the West and to China. And, you know, to Jane's point earlier, too, you know, China needs us, right? I mean, they're exporting more to us than they can before. So the idea that they're going to suddenly jump to being anti-Western, I don't think is very likely. But they're also going to assert their influence in the world. And so managing this transition, you know, from a financial standpoint, from a political standpoint, from a military standpoint, to me, this is the great challenge that we face in the 21st century. And you know, how we do this, whether we succeed or not, and we can do it peacefully, you know, will probably be the most important outcome in our lives, both, you know, at a personal level and financially.
In the meantime, investors need to put money to work, and I think of sovereign wealth funds and how they're deploying their capital. Rishi, from where you sit, how are the sovereign wealth funds of the Middle East making their decisions on where they put their money?
Well, first of all, they are in the happy position of running or likely to run significant budget surpluses this year after many, many years. So I think everyone is aware of the fact that the Middle East, for long, has been an exporter of capital, and it's going to be an even larger exporter of capital if current levels of energy prices hold up. Now, I don't pretend to have a perfect crystal ball into the thinking of the sovereign wealth funds in that part of the world, but if you put on the hat of a typical institutional investor, including
maybe we can have someone help you with, oh, there we go.
Including the
Good job with the Britney Spears mic.
Good save, thank you.
Yeah, my technology background came in handy. So, including these sovereign wealth funds, I think much along the lines of what was mentioned earlier, this is a moment in time where the micro trumps the macro, right, at multiple levels, because the underlying outlook is so uncertain and so unclear in terms of what is the likely direction of travel for economies, the major economies, not just the Western Hemisphere, but some of the larger emerging markets, as we used to call them, that, you know, it is inevitably now a decision for us as sophisticated investors to choose the sectors and lean in behind those that have secular long-term trends behind them. Services businesses that are less exposed to raw material price increases. Healthcare and wellness, where there is a clear need and growing demographic need for those digitization-based businesses. Even in real estate that David was referring to, which is clearly a very attractive asset class and is continuing to attract a lot of interest from sovereign wealth funds, there are certain sectors like multifamily housing, like student housing, that are easily indexed to inflation, where the rent reprices on an annual basis, unlike commercial real estate where the lease terms tend to be longer. Those indexed asset classes within real estate are meaningfully more attractive, and that's how the sovereign wealth funds are thinking. The same institutional investors now see the huge attraction of floating rate loans. With the base rates going up, you know, basically the base rates are now roughly equal to the spreads on leveraged loans. So you have effectively created the ability to to double your absolute return on a portfolio of rolling rate loans, even compared to 6 months ago. I mean, I'll just use one anecdote over here, and this goes back to my point about this is the time for a combination of agility and ability to manifest itself, right? That's really where we differentiate ourselves, and that's what the institutions are looking for. In March, in the middle of that Ukraine conflict, we priced a CLO in Europe. People were looking at us as if we were crazy. No one was pricing CLOs. I think we were amongst 3, right? But in doing that, we captured the spreads that were prevalent at that time and created 300 basis points of IRR surplus. That's the agility, right? But you have to have the ability to be able to do that, and that's really where I
love that, the agility and the ability. And David, you provided us with a meme as well. Let's pull that up. And it goes back to the Fed again, and the Fed is an upside-down plane trying to land. Flaps down, gears down, ready for a soft landing. Maybe not. Rishi talked about agility and ability. There's a whole new generation of investors that have never operated in this kind of environment, with this level of uncertainty, with interest rates rising, with inflation accelerating. They simply lack experience. They lack the ability to operate in this environment. What could go wrong when you have a whole new generation of investors? And I think about the US and the retail investors in particular, who only buy the dip.
Well, I think that, and I know there's a lot of very experienced investors in the room, but there's probably also some who are in their first decade. And I think that, unfortunately, there's an awful lot of focus on volatility is the same as risk. And that, ladies and gentlemen, fundamentally is not true, right? You only lose money when you sell a security for less than you bought it or you permanently impair it. Whether or not the market tends to mark things up or down is not a loss. And I think this is really important for long-term investors because those of us that look through cycles, we hear what we just talked about volatility, the next couple of years being difficult. That says opportunity. Right, that says now we're going to be willing to pay for people that have really good skills at selecting securities and countries and industries. So actually active management will become even more valued in an environment like that. And actually it's a good time to put money to work. So part of the problem of the last decade almost has been it's been high prices everywhere. Well, maybe finally we're going to be able to get into a number of these asset classes, which have been tough, at a more reasonable entry point. And that's actually good. So I would just encourage all of you, don't think of, as you hear about all of the risks and the volatilities, to think, oh, that's de facto a bad thing. It is actually also, if you're a long-term investor, a real opportunity.
Andres, jump in here. What do you think is the outlook here? How are you thinking about this generation of investors dealing with these uncertain moments, something they've never experienced before?
Yeah, I think more than not dealing with uncertainty, I think people didn't deal with cost of capital, right? And when the cost of dreaming is 0, the dreams go to infinite, right? Sounds a little bit onirical, but at the end it's mathematical. It's a classic division by 0. So that's it's somehow what I think is happening. I think clearly, in more technical terms, Fed need to tight financial conditions. There is a meaning for that, and a clear scientific and objective impact in asset prices. So I think there will be some more I would say emotions ahead of us in terms of asset prices, because I think capital markets were much less rigorous than historical terms in terms of evaluating narratives, business models, growth forecasts. I think this lack of cost capital for the last 15 years, and just remember, financially speaking, we had 15 years in a row of negative real interest rates. It's unseen. Very few periods of our history we had this situation. And combined with that, at the end of this cycle, we needed, because our societies demanded and our political leadership delivers, including central banks, amazing monetary expansion together with amazing fiscal expansion. So all of these ingredients together will probably result as a classic consequence on tight financial conditions, which means, as I said, a new cost of capital, which means a new cost for our dreams. So dreams will go back to earth a little bit.
That is the line of the panel. When the cost of dreaming zero, dreams go to infinity.
Yeah. Sounds onirical, but again, it's mathematical, right? It's a classic division by zero.
I think also when you can apply the same question to the real economy as well, in terms of, what is it that CEOs, CFOs, you've had a whole generation of leaders that outside of some emerging markets have not had to manage in an inflationary world.
On the operations side.
And on the operations side, well, right now you're seeing corporates with the ability, a lot of power to pass that on to the consumer. And the consumer has a lot right now of cash in their wallets. Savings rates went way up, they're back down again, but there's a lot of cash still sitting there, and that provides a buffer. Inventories have been providing a buffer in all of this as well at the moment. I think the real question is, how long can corporates continue to pass on these price increases they're seeing, the supply chain issues? I'm a bit worried about the summer, because we're seeing the consumer switch in behavior now to starting to focus on services again. COVID, it was Delta, kind of put a bit of a caboose on everything that was to do with services. That's going to come roaring back. It's starting to again. We're seeing it in consumer spending. And that will put more pressure on labor supply again. It could be quite a tricky summer on that point of view for inflation. And that again is going to be another challenge for the corporates. Can they continue to push the purchasing power on? And if not, they better go and talk to our friends in Brazil about how do you manage your working capital. Because the treasurers, we've started having a lot of conversation with the treasurers of our multinational clients around the world, because you can live and die by your working capital management, and that's what they're not used to doing yet. So it's not just the negative real interest rates and the changes that we talk about with the investors and the Treasury Department. What are you doing about your working capital? It's going to be bumpy.
Yeah, and we're going to hear from the companies as they try to manage through that the next couple of months.
Yeah. And it's important to say that when we talk about price corrections and new cost of capital, it's not related to innovation, right? Innovation will continue to happen. It's just related to prices. Right? You have some of the big caps of today had an amazing and wild correction in 2000, right? And they're here. Healthy, fantastic company. If the value is 1, 2, or 3 trillion, market will discuss and decide and price. But changing financial asset prices is not related to changing the innovation course, the technological fantastic revolution. This will continue to happen. Just the prices will change.
Okay, so let's talk about what the price change would be for stocks, for bonds, for Bitcoin, Scott, if we're going to have to consider the new cost of dreaming.
Well, I mean, first off, I wanted to make a comment about real interest rates, which is there's some delusion out there that you're supposed to get a real rate of return on U.S. Treasury securities. And these are supposed to be risk-free assets. But when you look at history, especially with Treasury bills, real returns have been negative like 40% of the time. So this idea that we have to get a real return on bonds,
it's misguided.
Just mythology, right? But to go to the inflation question for a minute, there's something going on right now that I think is under the radar that people are not picking up on, and in 2 or 3 weeks I'll probably hear about it on Bloomberg, and that is that there's a lot of demand destruction going on. And that is, when you have your average worker in California who's paying $7 or $8 a gallon for gasoline, and he's making a decision about how he's going to spend the money that he has.
Left over after he pays for his gas.
There's a lot of other things that are getting cut out.
Yeah.
And, I've heard stories about, I use the example of my gardener. Is he going to take his children to Burger King this weekend, right? But, I've heard other anecdotal stories about cosmetic companies where sales are down 40%. So there's a lot of things that are happening in the underlying economy right now where you have demand destruction going on in certain sectors. And this, I think, is the same point about picking industries, which is, once we settle out at this new price level, where will we destroy demand and where will we create new demand? And again, to the point that there have been real winners here. I mean, the energy companies have been great winners. I'm not panicked so much about this inflation thing and the whole bit, as long as we have disciplined monetary policy. My only concern is that, you know, we were driving at 80 mile an hour down the freeway, and suddenly, you know, we saw up ahead of us somebody put their foot on the brake about a quarter of a mile ahead, so we're slamming on the brakes, which is likely to cause an accident. And I would rather...
If you don't hit a pothole first.
Right, and I would rather just, hey, maybe as Greenspan would say, let's just take our foot off the accelerator and let's see what happens here. But, you know, I think the inflation, as long as the world is pulling liquidity out of the system, I don't think that inflation is going to be the problem. It's going to be the demand destruction and how it falls out between industries.
All right, so you didn't quite get him to bite on the crypto.
I know.
So let me have a whack at that, because it's been much in the news, and I think in particular, you know, a number of retirement companies have recently said that they're actually going to make you know, actual 401k
Fidelity
available.
among them, yes.
And I do think that there's absolutely nothing wrong with putting money into cryptocurrency, in my view. There's many speculations around the world which are absolutely fine and wonderful to do. But we shouldn't confuse that with a fiduciary investment that we should be recommending. And for us, anyway, there are three criteria for that. We need a asset class that has a consistent regulatory oversight. We need an asset class that has a store of value that's more than just what someone else will pay for it. And we need an asset class where we understand what the correlation between it and other asset classes are, so we can put it into a portfolio. Right now, most cryptocurrencies are 0 for 3 on that. And I think we have to be very clear, particularly with that new generation of investors who have had a zero cost of capital. And so one of Andre's fantastical things, I think, has been cryptocurrency. And we need to help them be educated into, there's nothing wrong with speculation, but that's not retirement investing.
Right, well, let me jump in, because look, I heard a quote recently which I really loved, which is, you know, when interest rates are zero, the cost of dreams are, you know, and so, you know, I think crypto has a lot of that to it. But, you know, look at, you know, AMC or GameStop or all this stuff. This gamification of investing which has occurred by a generation which has no experience with it looks a lot to me like what we saw in the late 90s with the internet bubble. And, you know, whether it was, you know, the bookseller called Amazon or the pet supply store called Pets.com that was going to be the winner, you know, who knew? But I know that, you know, we ended up selling a sock puppet for $1 million, and that was Pets.com, and Amazon went on to be a behemoth.
Yeah.
And so, you know, I think the world of crypto, it's real. What's happening here, virtual currencies are real. But it's the Wild West right now, and in terms of trying to sort out who the winner is going to be, I think it's much too early to know.
Where does that leave private assets, Rishi? And I'm looking to you because there have obviously been a lot of structural changes in investing, and people are plowing money into private assets. We've seen banks lose market share to private lenders. So there's a lot of assets on private balance sheets that's unregulated. What do we know, based on history, what's going to happen when growth slows down, we possibly tip into recession? What happens to those balance sheets?
Yeah, I think the best way to address that question, Scarlett, is in 2011, there was a book bestseller that came out called Thinking Fast and Slow, Daniel Kahneman and Amos Tversky, right? We are the private markets, private assets, we are the slow thinkers. I'm the slow thinker on this panel today. And what I mean by that is we have the real good fortune, the benefit of being able to look past the noise and invest behind the long-term signals, right? And the ability to look through the cycle and invest in companies or assets, whether it's real estate or private equity or even private credit, with a 5-year outlook where they have some ability, some pricing power, some ability to manage their cost structure, in the middle of this uncertain interest rate and inflationary environment, some ability to expand geographically to create diversification of sources of revenues. That's exactly what you asked your question earlier in terms of what are sovereign wealth funds looking for. I was talking to one of the largest pension plans in the US yesterday. They have meaningfully increased their allocation to private assets over the course of the last year, precisely for this reason, right? Because they are slow thinkers, right? They are more than happy to invest behind a long-term return generation potential that is able to ride out the interim volatility and is able to generate sustainable value creation.
Forget 2024, 2025.
Exactly. Forget the 2023, 2024. Look at the 25, 26, 27 horizon. That's what we do. Thinking slow, that's the mantra.
Well, you know, one point I want to make really quickly, and that is I find with private assets that I often get better information than I do than public securities.
Really?
Yeah.
Why is that?
Because you can get the CEO on the phone, and he's not going to hide from you some piece of non-public information that he can't tell you because there's going to be an earnings announcement or whatever. I mean, you can have frank conversations. You can get a real internal perspective of what's happening.
But I think that too much emphasis has been put on the origination side of private assets, which has been really important, and there's no question that institutional investor demand for it has gone up. But the real story with private assets is actually what's happened to the banking system. So over the last decade, and really since the GFC, when new regulations came in, banks just stopped growing their lending to the middle market. And they stopped financing a lot of things like project finance, infrastructure, asset-backed finance, and things that they used to be large players in. Those markets now have actually become available to institutional investors. And players like PGIM, we have almost $250 billion in private assets, and private credit is one of our fastest growing areas because banks have not really stepped into that.
Well, banks have been held back by regulators.
They absolutely have. But this is a fundamental change in the way the U.S. economy is being financed, from one that was very bank-dominated to one now that is much more dominated by LPs.
Okay, so let's bring in Jane Fraser here.
Yeah, I would remind everyone as well, that you're right, that the regulators and other pieces means that there's much more push into the capital markets, but I would remind everyone March 2020. March 2020, when there was before the Fed stepped in and the US government did something incredible, we were always there. And the piece on the liquidity and the other components, and I tell you, my bank, we love so many of you in the room, you're wonderful clients, we're very grateful for you. We were there in every single asset class at that point until they stepped in. So I would also just say there is, don't write off the banks.
Oh, no,
Absolutely critical role in the market, because when the proverbial hits the fan, we will be there for you, and we'll be there for you in all the asset classes as we prove in March 2020, and we'll be proud to do so.
But at the same time, banks are a little bit more shielded than during the last crisis,
I mean, I think the U.S. banking system is in very strong shape. We went into COVID in strong shape. We're able to support clients. We came out of COVID in strong shape, helped again by the central banks, U.S. Treasury, et cetera, the actions they took. And as we enter this next one as well, the capital balance sheets are strong, and we're there to help the clients navigate the crisis ahead, whatever it may be. We will be there.
Just going back to the crypto discussion, and I think we talked about dreams and cost of dreams, right? And of course, a piece of that is related to that. But I think there is amazing technology coming from that space, right? I think blockchain will transform the way that we interact with each other business-wise. I believe in some sort of central bank digital currencies, decentralized finance, all of that are technology that probably has immense potential of transform our financial lives in the future. But there is a strong aspect of that which is related to regulation, that we don't talk enough about that, but regulators globally, or societies globally, took a very long and tough 20 years to create a reasonable framework to avoid anti-money laundering and information exchange, and this is done via financial system. I can't see how people will give up, us as societies, give up this infrastructure that was not easy to build, and today is reasonably efficient, right? Yeah. It's not easy for you to be a financial criminal in the world these days, and it's achievement of our society. And I think it's an important piece to pay attention on regarding the crypto space.
All right, we have to wrap things up, and I figure on that note, speaking of financial actors, we're in LA, so some executive somewhere, maybe even in this room, is on the prowl for the next hit TV series, especially now that Netflix has proven to be kind of vulnerable. is there a TV series, I'm going to ask each of you, that you think captures the zeitgeist, that really is a sign of the times? I've noticed that there are a lot of TV shows about scammers. Anna Delvey, my father will wire you the money, okay? Or saying, Dropout, with CEOs that maybe overpromised and underdelivered. Is there anything to you that kind of captures what's going on?
I'm not a very fan of TV series, but I would say that the status of the world now is more for Discovery Channel or Animal Planet, especially that African wilderness kind of, that's my knowledge, right?
Discovery Channel, okay. Jane?
If a pandemic unjustified war and so on.
Well, I think it's less Bridgerton and more a combination of Succession and Ted Lasso.
Ooh, love it. David Hunt.
Yeah, I do think it's the next rendition of Ted Lasso. It's where the stories of leadership and the stories of optimism just dominated so wonderfully.
That's a feel-good. Rishi, any thoughts?
Yeah, you know, when we started, it used to be price to EBITDA, then it was price to revenue, now it's price to vision. We crashed.
We crashed. Scott Minerd?
I think the show will be, hey, Mom, Dad, can you send me a check?
All right, on that note, thank you so much to our esteemed panelists, André Esteves, Jane Fraser, David Hunt, Rishi Kapoor, and Scott Minerd.